We are right now. We are right now in the middle of the book of Revelation. In fact, we are going to get to the fulcrum verse. Hopefully, this session, which will be chapter 12, verse 11. And really interestingly, I'm I don't know if John planned it this way, but it is really the thematic verse of the entire the book of Revelation. But when we left off last time, we were talking about John's multivalent imagery, and we're at a point now where John is having an image. He's having a vision of a woman with a child, and she is being assailed by a dragon. And we were talking last time about the multivalent imagery that comes with this. In one sense, knowing John's Jewish background, the woman represents Israel, and of course their time in the desert, and of course the child represents Israel's Messiah. For later Christians, it's very easy to see, especially in the Roman Catholic Church, that the woman represents Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the child representing Jesus. Um, but there's also this image of the woman as church, and of course, being assailed by the beast, the dragon, excuse me, and sojourning for a time in the wilderness, which is metaphor, not so much the desert wilderness of Exodus, right, that Israel would have experienced, but the wilderness of being in the midst of tribulation. Previously, we saw that for a time, the Gentiles were going to, I can't remember what the word was that was used, but take siege to the outer court of the temple. And this is a reference to the people of the earth, those who are not under God's sign of baptism, opposing the church. And this is often referred to as the time of great distress or the time of tribulation. John has in mind here the experience of the church in the time that he's writing. And he uses the metaphor, the symbolic reference to a year and 2 years and a half, or a season and 2 seasons and a half a season, 3.5 years. Also referred to as 42 months, also referred to as 1,260 days as well. So that's where we were last time, and I'm just gonna pick up reading all of chapter 12. It's pretty short, and it really needs to be dealt with as a piece. And so as I read it, hopefully you'll remember some of the things that we talked about. But are there any, before I move on and begin reading, are there any questions or comments anyone would like to make? And please speak up, because I can only see about 4 of you at a time. Oh, Sharon's with us now. Welcome, Sharon.
Sorry to be late.
Well, it will count against your grade. You know what my policy is. So, okay.
Good to see you.
All right, I'm reading chapter 12. And a great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pangs and the agony of giving birth. Then another portent appeared in heaven, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his head. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne, and the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God so that there she can be nourished, literally fed, for 1,260 days. There's that number again. Then, starting at verse 7, which we have not discussed, and war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer a place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven proclaiming, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of the Messiah." So I'm going to stop right there, and hopefully we can pick up a little bit later on, because there's a lot, and I don't want us to get lost in what is coming afterwards. This may be familiar to a lot of us, the image, especially those of us who spent some time with Milton, Paradise Lost, the image of Satan and his angels being thrown out of heaven. However, the image to us on this side of John's writing of the book of Revelation, the image for us does not necessarily match up with what John has to say, because remember what we're dealing with here. John is seeing a vision that is directly relevant to his context. The woman, of course, representing Israel and representing the church. And I should mention here that for John, those two are one and the same. We are in the habit these days of looking at a very strong distinction between Israel on the one hand and the church, Christians on the other. But remember John's Jewish Christian background. If it hasn't been impressed upon you yet, it should be by now. John is a Jewish Christian who firmly believes that Jesus, the child in the woman's arms, is the Messiah, that same Jesus who has been taken up into heaven, and now they are living in the time symbolically and actually of tribulation. The woman's retreat into the desert is reminiscent of Israel's retreat to the desert, in Exodus, but it's also happening again, history repeating itself. The church is retreating, you might say, or the church is experiencing the tribulation of being in the desert as the world impresses or imposes itself in a very violent way on the church. This is the beginning of some martyrdoms that were beginning to happen, and we'll see reference to that in John. But on this side of the writing of this book, we think of the battle, the war that breaks out in heaven as having happened well before the beginning of creation. This is how Milton sees it, right? Even before Adam and Eve were created, there was an angel by the name of Satan who refused to be obedient to God. And as a result, according to Milton's story and the story that is going to develop subsequent to John, gathered some of his angels and fought against the powers of heaven, the angels in heaven, and as a result was thrown out of heaven. That happens well before Israel even comes into existence in our understanding. But that's not what's going on here. John is seeing something that is current. John is seeing something that is current. He sees a battle happening in heaven, and as we're going to see, that battle is won. That battle is won. Satan is cast out, and now Satan is doubly angry because he's lost his place in heaven, and now he has been relegated simply to the earth itself. and he's none too happy about the whole thing. And it's here that John, so my point being is that this story, this reference later gets developed into a kind of pre-lapsarian, before the fall story that happens in heaven, and Satan being thrown out of heaven. That's not what John is saying here. This is relevant to John's context. So let me stop there. I tried to make that point, but we last time, but it was rather quick, and I wanted to make sure that we were together. And I'm sorry that Dwight Marsh is not with us, because I'd love to hear from him on this. Are there any comments or questions about this? Angels being tossed from heaven. I think the important point here is the one that I want to make is that for John, Israel and the church are one and the same. He does not make the kind of distinction that we tend to make rather easily. There's Jews and there's Christians. John, as we've been arguing throughout this whole class, is a Jewish Christian who sees Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, who now opens the doors for Gentiles to come into the church. And those Gentiles would most likely still be practicing some of the Jewish rituals that were so important, and hearing some of the stories that are obviously so important to John and his, his understanding, his cosmology, his understanding of the world. But here we're introduced for the first time to an angel, Michael. War broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. Angels, of course, are just commonplace for us. We understand that, God has archangels and God has angels, archangels Gabriel and Michael and Uriel and all of those that can be named. But angelology in Israel at this time is a relatively recent phenomenon. We don't hear about an elaborate, and we've talked about this before, we don't hear about elaborate angelologies, or an understanding of the hierarchies of angels in the Old Testament. Now, there are times in the Old Testament when an angel wrestles, for example, with Jacob, but this understanding that there is a host of angels around God is a relatively recent idea. And we've mentioned this before, and I can't remember if it was this class, but I think it was a previous class that we were doing. This only develops in Israel in about the 2nd century. And it would have been about the time that Daniel was writing his apocalyptic text. In fact, Daniel is the first person to refer to Michael as an archangel. Now remember, Daniel, though the story of Daniel presumably takes place in Babylon around the middle of the 6th century, we know from historical references that are made in Daniel that it was written during the Maccabean, or shortly after the Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century, around 162, 63 BCE. And it's here that Daniel, the prophet, makes this reference as if everybody knows what he's talking about. He's having a vision, and this vision, very much like John's, right? He says this, "But then a hand touched me and roused me to my hands and knees. He said to me, 'Daniel, greatly beloved, pay attention to the words that I'm going to speak to you. Stand on your feet, for I have now been sent to you.' So while he was speaking this word to me, I stood up and trembling. He said to me, 'Do not fear, Daniel, for the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before God, your words have been heard, and I have come because of your words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia opposed me 21 days. So Michael, one of the chief priests, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I left him there with the prince of the kingdom of Persia.'" And then later on, you hear But I am to tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth. There is no one with me who contends against these princes except Michael, your prince. If you're reading this at a time, you're just like, wait, who's this Michael? Where's he come from? It's not even mentioned that he's an angel, but a prince of heaven, right? Well, in the time period between when Daniel is being written and when John is being written, roughly about 300 years, there is an angelology, an understanding of how God exists in God's heaven with angels around God. This has its earliest, I guess, we get the earliest inclination of this in one of God's names in the Old Testament, Elohim, which literally means the gods, and it's often referred to as the God of hosts. El is the name of the Canaanite god, and Ohim is the plural of that, right? When it's spoken about in the early 10th century, for example, it's understood that God is the greatest God among all the gods, right? After the Babylonian captivity, though, Jews came to recognize that there were no other gods. There was just God, right? There was just God. It's strict monotheism. Let's hold fast to this. But there's something about the human mind. There's something about human nature that requires us to think in polytheistic terms. There's not just one God. That's so hard for humans. It's very easy for us to live in a world where there are many gods. One God makes it difficult for us to explain, why does evil happen in a world when God is good and, God's all powerful? That creates a conundrum for us. But if you posit that there are many gods, well, you can easily understand it. This is what the Zoroastrians did, right? There are good gods and there are bad gods. The good gods are responsible for evil in the world. The bad gods the good gods are responsible for good in the world, the bad gods for evil in the world. But of course, if you're Jewish, you can't affirm this because there is no God but God, as the Muslims say, and the Lord our God is one, as the Jews say. So what do you do in that situation? Well, because of the Greek context in which the Israelites, the Jews, are living, because Greeks are telling stories that they were hearing frequently, that Jews were hearing frequently about many gods here, and about Zeus and about Apollo and all the gods that we've mentioned, it became natural for them to start to attribute to the God of heaven, the one God, a host of lower beings around that God who were created beings, but they weren't immortal like God. This was a theological means by which they were able to explain and to take on a kind of polytheism that served an important purpose. And the important purpose here is precisely what we're talking about. Now we can understand why there's evil in the world. It's because of these evil angels, right? That are now having a battle in heaven. They've been kicked out of heaven. And there's great rejoicing in heaven, but oh no, the problem is now those evil angels are here on earth with us. And they're the ones who are going to be responsible for the martyrdoms that we as the church, the woman in the desert, right, are experiencing. Doubly so because Satan's pretty upset about it. He's just been kicked out of his home, right? And now the tribulation is going to certainly begin. So that was a long excursus, and I'm sorry, and if it was a little too much, but are there questions about that, comments? I'm hoping you're with me on polytheism and angelology. Comments? Okay. So maybe at some other time we can talk about the natural tendency of humans to be polytheistic. Uh, a world with many gods is much easier to live in than a world with one God. Though the Christian and Jewish and Muslim traditions insist upon the latter, right? So we now have the narrative of the fallen angels, and this is the first time in the Bible that Satan is now identified with the serpent of the garden. We had this conversation in a Bible study when we were still doing it on Wednesday mornings at 7 o'clock. And I think there were a couple of people there who didn't really like what I had to say about this. I can only conjecture that because they never showed up afterwards. But when you read the story of Genesis, the story where Eve is confronted by the serpent, the wiliest of God's creatures, nowhere in Genesis does that say that that serpent is Satan. So in its historical context, when that story was being written in the 10th century BCE, there was not a concept of Satan in the minds of Jews. However, we've seen how this concept is developed. We get references made to Satan in the Old Testament, only twice, actually. The most, I guess the one that's best known is in Job, where Satan, the accuser, bets with God against Job on whether or not Job can keep up his righteousness, right? And the whole story is about how Job, endures all of this, this great tribulation. But we don't hear about Satan but twice in very, very late manuscripts written somewhere between the 3rd and the 2nd century, right? And so we're also developing a theology at this time where we now have John is recognizing that the serpent in the garden is the very dragon that he's referring to. And so this whole imagery of the dragon and the woman is a recapitulation, if you might say, or another symbolic reference of the confrontation that happens in the garden. Now we know from this perspective in the 1st century when John is writing that the serpent is Satan, but it doesn't say that in the Old Testament. We have to look back on it from the advantage point of history and theology that is now developed. Now we know that the serpent in the garden is Satan. And we have two names here that are really important for us to understand the theology that goes around who Satan is. Understand that he is one of the great created angels of God who has now rebelled against heaven. And he has a Hebrew name, Ha-Satan, or Ha-Satan would be, meaning the accuser. If you ever grew up with brothers and sisters, I don't mean to make a bad reference here, but I remember I grew up with 2 younger sisters, and they were always accusing me of doing things. When my mom would come home or my dad would come home, and there'd be cookies gone from the cookie jar. Well, my sisters were the first ones to point the finger. Well, it was Dan. Look what he did wrong. The tattletale. That's the image that we have of Satan in the Old Testament. It's not quite as evil, filled with all of those special effects that we hear or see in like The Exorcist, right? There's none of that in this name. It's the naysayer. Satan is the one who, well, it's like in the book of Job. Hey, have you seen Satan? Have you seen my servant Job? What a righteous guy this guy is. He's fantastic. He just prays all the time. He tithes, he cares for the poor, the widows, and all this. And Satan is the naysayer. But the only reason he does that is because you give him everything he wants. I mean, you take that away and we'll see just how righteous this guy is. So Satan is the guy, who's always pointing the finger, trying to accuse you of being less righteous and tattletaling, telling on you to God. That's the image we have of the Hebrew Satan. The Greek word here, and both words are used in this text. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil, Diabolos, and Satan, right? The serpent from the garden, who's Satan, as well as Diabolos. Diabolos is the Greek name, and I love the way Greek words are put together, because you have a prefix, dia, which means a cross, like a diagram or something that's written across, and bolos is where we get our word ball from, something that is thrown. Literally, diabolos here in Greek means someone who's casting aspersions on you, someone who throws nasty, slanderous words your way. This is who Satan is. Not unlike what we've seen in the Hebrew word, right? This guy's not righteous. He's just as evil as the rest, right? That is the slanderer that Satan is. And Satan now wants to slander the church, the woman who represents the church, just as Israel in the past has been slandered. And so I really should be spending more time with Greek words in this study, because a whole world opened up for me when I learned to read Greek. And John is actually pretty easy to read in Greek, unlike, let's say, Luke or Matthew. But the Gospel of John, as well as the book of Revelation, very easy to read. So the defeat of Satan has been accomplished in heaven, but not on earth yet. That is to come later. And so I really like to reflect a little bit on this Peter Bruegel, the elder, painting of the text that we're talking about, the battle of the angels in heaven. And it's very similar for those of you who are in the Eisenheim altarpiece Sunday school class. The non-repentant angels, the evil angels, if you will, who are thrown out of heaven, are represented in very malformed ways. You may remember in the Eisenheim altarpiece, the Saint Anthony was being tempted by all of these really strange looking creatures, right? The demons. The same is true here of Bruegel, who's roughly a contemporary of Grunewald, a little later. But you have all of these fallen angels who, have the wings of a moth, for example, or the face of a bird. You can see here the image of a fish, as if to represent the malformation, if I can use the word, bastardization of creation that was originally created good. And this is how evil works. It gives you the sense of the original goodness that has somehow been transformed towards the bad, or transformed towards darkness, or transformed to evil. But it's just recognizable enough as still retaining some of its goodness that it can deceive us, right? And this is in the 16th century. This was one of the things that the artist tried to get across, the demons in our world still bear a lot of resemblance to us and to things that are original in God's creation. They were originally created by God, but something, transformed them. Something moved them towards the darkness. And so I love this image of Michael, with his shield. And it's an image that is going to crop up again and again and again in Renaissance art. This is, I mentioned last time, the prayer that was often spoken to Saint Michael prior to Vatican II, but it's a prayer that's still used among Catholics. But for those who feel that they are living in a world that is still haunted by these demons, we're living still waiting that final day of judgment to come. And Satan is, though cast out of heaven, still present here. And the so-called strong man, as Jesus called him. And we, in our sinfulness, need supernatural help, not to fall victim to those temptations. So this prayer of Saint Michael, I thought I'd put it up here. Saint Michael, the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our defense against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who roam throughout the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Rather reflective of a rather medieval worldview where spirits still roam through the world. And that's probably the reason that it was not spoken after in the Mass after Vatican II. Any questions or comments about that?
Dan,
Yeah,
it is used every Mass locally,
it is. Oh yeah, of course it would be.
following the service of Mass. Yeah.
I can't, who's speaking?
Sharon.
Oh, Sharon, okay.
Yep.
You could imagine that in the Lincoln Diocese, it would be spoken. The Lincoln Diocese that would prefer that we go back to the pre-Vatican structure of the church, where we still had a Latin Mass, right?
And I asked John about that, my husband, and he said that it's a part of the intercessory idea that we are a communion of saints, and that we ask one another to fight for us. So it's kind of a modern take on that.
Oh, I see. But is it this exact prayer that I just
Yes.
read?
Yes.
It is. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a big fan of this idea of being in constant spiritual battle against evil forces in the world, because it gets us. I mean, look at what it did with the Puritans, right? Everything, there was evil lurking behind every bush and every branch. I'm in a prayer chain right now. I think I've mentioned this, where we're praying for a young child that has been born prematurely, but we're being referred to as prayer warriors. And we have prayer targets, every day that we're praying for. And it's just a little too militant. It's just a little too, the military metaphor is just a little too much for me. Because we remember, we're still living in a world that was created good by God. So trying to strike a balance between recognizing, yes, that this world still, we're still carrying out a battle, so to speak, or a struggle with forces that tempt us away from the law of God. But it's still a world where brightness outshines the darkness. And I want to keep that ever in front of myself, because it's very easy to fall into the temptations of thinking that we're living in a dark time with no light. And I just don't see that as the case. And this is what happens if we get too caught up in reading, the revelation of John, and becoming too obsessed with it, I think, as many Puritans did, if you read Nathaniel Hawthorne. This image of Michael, this is René's Michael the Archangel, and you see this throughout a lot of Renaissance paintings, with his foot on Satan. Also becomes kind of this archetypal image for St. George and the dragon. St. George, in most Anglican churches, you'll see some sort of reference to St. George. but you've got all the images here. You've got the damsel in distress, right? You've got the archetype of Saint Michael, and you've got the dragon, who is the representative of Satan here. And so I think these things are so, as someone who's interested in Carl Jung, I think these images are so intriguing because they come up again and again in art, and sometimes in our dreams, as Carl Jung said. Any other comments about this?
I apologize for being late, Dan. It's Penny.
Yes.
A friend of mine has cancer, and I
Awesome.
finally had a chance to talk with her at length, and I didn't want to cut that off.
Okay, I saw you come in. Yeah.
I'm sorry. This is such a great time. I'm sorry to disrupt. But I guess I wonder, with your comments about prayer warriors and targets, if we're really talking about the politicization
of
faith per se, which is so prominent in our time uniquely.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention that. I don't think we've gone through that in the same way recently, at least. I mean, you would know better throughout history, but
well, this particular person happens to be a parent whose son is a career military person, right? And so that you can just see how that pride for the son influences some of the metaphors that are used in in the prayers that are told. But I'm all for praying for children who are premature and need, God's help. I don't want to be part of a prayer infantry. I'd rather use a different metaphor. Well, Satan's thrown out of heaven, and there's great celebration in heaven. So I'm going to pick up reading at verse 10.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would take it then that you're not too fond of onward Christian soldiers.
You know what? No, not so. But when I was a kid, that used to be one of my favorite hymns.
Mine too.
That's it's so easy. But right. And I remember when I was in Kentucky, it was right after college, and we were doing a hymn sing, and unthinkingly, I said, "Hey, how about onward Christian soldiers?" My friend, hits me with an elbow and says, "That's so militaristic. We don't need that." But the idea of, a crusade and things like this, it just doesn't represent the Christ that I read about in the Gospels. But you're right. Not a fan of that, Richard. And so.
Well, it used to be that Bible study took place in the schools.
Right.
After school let out, you went to Bible school, but it was still at Longfellow School, and you sang Onward Christian Soldiers every day.
And
we marched around the little gym just like we were warriors off to war.
Right. And of course, Richard, that was right in the middle of the Cold War, wasn't it? Where our national identity was tied up in being the antithesis of that godless communism on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And so onward Christian soldiers really took on a national importance at that time.
Yes.
Was that the time that we're talking about? I hate to date you there. Right in the middle of the Cold War, late 50s, early 60s, McCarthy era time?
Well, mine would have been in the late 40s.
Late 40s? Okay, good. Well, I'm going to continue reading with verse 10. This is the proclamation, the celebration in heaven. Now have come salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our comrades has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. But they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they did not cling to life even in the face of death. And this is that fulcrum verse in the book of Revelation. This is the central. There are the same number of verses before this as the same number of verses after it. I'm not sure that John actually had this in mind, but it falls right in the center of the book, right? So I'll read it again. The accuser's been thrown down, but they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they did not cling to life even in the face of death. Rejoice then, you heavens, and those who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you with great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. So God's plan is halfway done. The devil is thrown out of heaven. And I think it's really interesting to note the connection here between diabolos and Satan being cast out. Diabolos means the one who throws things, right? The one who slanders, who casts aspersions. The word that is used for being thrown out stems from the same root, to throw. The thrower is thrown out, basically, of heaven. And his claim there is null and void. He can not accuse anyone in the realm of heaven, especially those martyrs who are, as we've already seen, existing under the mercy seat of God, right? Satan has nothing to say. He has been thrown out of heaven by two things: conquered by the blood of the Lamb and conquered by the testimony of the martyrs. The word testimony, martyrios, is where we get our word martyrdom from. And the emphasis here is on those who John may have known. We've already heard about Antipas, right, in the earlier chapters of this book, who was martyred. And John probably knows of other martyrs. But this martyrdom was not for nothing, John wants to say. It is all a part of the means by which victory, literally salvation, victory in heaven, comes to take place. Satan no longer has power there. But the problem is that for a short time, the church is going to experience doubly Satan's wrath. No accuser in heaven, but he is still an accuser on earth for a short time. And we presume that short time is that 3.5 years, that 42 months, 1,260 days that John has in mind. So I'm going to move on because I would like to finish chapter 12. We move back then to the image of the woman. Now we are not in heaven anymore. Now we are on earth, right? This image taking place is on earth. So I'm picking up with verse 13. So when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down, again, thrown out, down to the earth, he pursued, literally, he persecuted the woman. The same Greek word can be used for pursue and to persecute. He pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she could fly from the serpent into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished or fed for a time and times and a half a time. There again, that 3.5 years. Then from his mouth, the serpent poured water like a river after the woman to sweep her away with the flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman. It opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured forth from its mouth. Then the dragon was angry with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her children, those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. Then the dragon took his stand on the sand and on the sea. So the dragon's still pursuing the woman in the desert, but the woman is able to escape. And we hear this reference that comes from the Old Testament, especially Exodus 19:4. And this is where God tells the Israelites, don't you remember that I was the one that bore you out of Egypt as if on eagle's wings? And the same thing is being said to Israel in the Babylonian captivity as they anticipate their return to Jerusalem. I will bear you up as on the wings of an eagle to bring you back into your land. Um, this torrent of water coming from the serpent's mouth is really interesting, and I wish I had more time to reflect on it. But the connection between the sea monster, right, who is also this red dragon that we talked about, and the Tehom, which is the Hebrew word for the chaos of the beginning of creation. This is the dragon wreaking chaos through the means by which the earth has been destroyed in the past by water. But the church will not be destroyed in this way. The earth itself opens up and takes this chaotic substance into itself to save the church and to save itself. The earth itself is going to be saved in this. And this really angers the dragon, because what has worked in the past, right? The means by which the earth was destroyed, the means by which destruction was meted out on the unfaithful and the faithful, I should say the unfaithful, now doesn't work. And it just makes the dragon all the more upset. So he turns from the woman and wages war on the rest of the woman's offspring, as if to say, we are now in the midst of the battle. The reason we're feeling this persecution is because the dragon, Satan, is mad. These are his death throes, so to speak. He is coming to a quick, a very, very quick end. And he's all the matter. He's a cornered beast. You all know what that's like, right? Well, maybe you don't, but the most dangerous animal is an injured, cornered animal. And I think this is what John is trying to get across. Satan has been injured and he's in the corner and the battle is closing in. And he is going to react in erratic and unpredictable ways, chaotic ways. This must have been what John felt that the church was experiencing as he is writing his letters. So that is where I'm going to leave us. We're now through chapter 12, and chapter 13 is going to pick up with another beast rising out of the sea. The sea, once again, an image that's often used throughout scripture of chaos. The connection of the serpent or the Leviathan or the beast in the sea is throughout scripture. We find it in Psalms especially, but also in Genesis 1. So are there any comments that you would like to make here or questions?
Dan, I would.
Yeah, go ahead, Mac.
Dan, I have several things that'd be fun to discuss, but I realize we don't have the time to do it. But
let's do it next time. I'll write them down. I'll remember. Okay.
But this is all a prelude to what's coming up in the next chapter, and that we can talk about this in terms of, John. It's Milton, it's the Old Testament, and clearly John knows his Old Testament and particularly his book of Daniel.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
It's lifting left and right out of there.
Right.
But basic, we went through the whole class today, and we didn't mention what I think is a basic, and that is the term Rome.
Oh, yeah, right. Yes, and that will become clear in chapter 13, won't it? The dragon is really kind of an ambiguous metaphysical creature at this point, but it's going to become very specifically more political in the chapters that ensue. That's a good point, and that introduces us to what's about to come. We're going to hear eventually about the number 666, which people have made great hay out of for centuries, right? But right, the pursuer here, the persecutor is definitely Rome, and the connection between Satan and Rome is one that John wants to make. So yeah, I appreciate that. We haven't mentioned anything about Rome, but it's going to come. It's going to happen. But I do want to tell you that Revelation has a happy ending. Okay. We're going to move towards something a little bit more celebratory. So thank you, everyone. I'm afraid I have to go to a meeting, and so I'm going to have to log off here just a little bit early. I do hope that my speaking isn't too overwhelming, and I just want to encourage you to interrupt me anytime if you have questions or comments or things you'd like to say, because these conversations are great conversations. So, but for now, I am going to leave you, and I will see you Wednesday, unless I see you on Sunday if you want to be part of the Eisenheim Alder Peace class. And I'll see you next Wednesday.
Okay. Thank you, Dan.
All right.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.